Hello, third graders. So today we're going to continue chapter 4, communities and how they change over time. But we're going to continue to lesson 5 with what can comparing different communities tell us about how communities change over time. So in the previous lessons, we talked about how communities have changed over time in comparison and contrast. We talked about how people or events can change communities. And you gave me a few examples of some people and how they affected their communities. For this lesson, we're going to be using our investigative skills to figure out how communities have changed over time. So kind of similar to what we were talking about before with inventions and people, but we're going to be talking about the whole group. And we're also going to be talking about how they've changed and what the effect is to you today. And then at the end of it, you're going to be learning and creating a list of topics that you want to research about your own community. So if you remember in the beginning of the chapter, you were given a project, and in that project, you had to find out about a community, research it, find information, and create a timeline. All of this information is to help you make sure that you are able to understand different parts of a community, like history, culture, and the people that live in a community. So that way, when you do that project, it'll be simple. And as you can see, we're on page 156 in lesson 5 inside your social studies workbook. And we have an image here that's from the Detroit Museum showing the impact of that the automobile had on the development of the city. I want you to think for a moment about a person that we talked about in the last lesson who was famous for their creation of the automobile and how that creation and how they affected the rest of the United States with what they did. Because in the other lesson, we also had that answer where we talked about who was famous and why they were famous. And so there was someone in there, if you can remember, who was responsible for helping make automobiles something that everyone could access. And so that's the top image. And the bottom image is a picture from Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. And it says large murals span across 2 outside walls of the National Museum in Malaysia's capital city, Kuala Lumpur. They show economic activities, cultural traditions, and events in the country's history. So Kuala Lumpur isn't part of the United States. It's a separate country. Malaysia is a separate country, and Kuala Lumpur is the capital of Malaysia. So it's in Southeast Asia. If you've ever seen Singapore, then you might know where it is. And now we'll continue to the next page. So we're going to start with analyzing the source, and that means we're going to be looking at what the text wants us to do. You can see it already on the left-hand side that it says that you have to inspect. What are we inspecting? We're going to read the title and look at the chart. On the right side, you can see that there's a chart with a line and it has dates on there, and it even has 2 locations on there. Detroit is in Michigan, and that's where the automobile factory was. So on the other side, you have Kuala Lumpur, and you can see that some things happened earlier in Detroit and they're at the top, and some things happened later in Detroit and they're at the bottom. And then on this same timeline, you have things that happened in Kuala Lumpur. Earlier is nearer to the top and later is nearer to the bottom. So you need to think about what this information is trying to tell you, because there has to be a reason for why they put dates and things happening and what happened on this line, and why are they showing 2 different cities? Do you think there's anything connected between them? The next thing you have to do is that you have to underline clues that'll help you answer these questions. So the first question is, what is a timeline? And you can answer it underneath where it says my notes. And the other question is, in what order does it list events? So you have the graphic, the chart over there that shows you something that is a line, and it does have years and dates on them. And so you already know that there's going to be dates listed in a specific organization and not just random dates in any which way. There has to be a sense of organization to it. And so why do you think that they put it in that way? Why do you think that they made it start with 1701? Why didn't they start from, 1600? And why do you think that they made it on the top or instead of on the bottom? Those are things that you can definitely think about with why they organized it like that and how it's organized. Then, after you're done answering that, you can circle the events that happened first on each side of the timeline. So you already know, based on how the timeline is organized, which one happened first. We talked about if it happened near the top in this timeline, then it is something that happened earlier, and you can see it from the number that it has. In this case, it says 1701 right here. So that's the year, 1701. And so the first thing would be what happened in Detroit, where it talks about Antoine de la Mothe, Cadillac founds Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit. So this could be talking about the city of Detroit. And then it says on the left-hand side, we're talking about Kuala Lumpur. You can even say it with the title. And it says in 1857 that Chinese tin miners founded a settlement at Kuala Lumpur. So that's what happened first in this chart, according to this chart. Then you're going to draw a box around the events that happened most recently on each side of the timeline. So we talked about what happened first is at the top. And we said that both of these things were probably the first things that happened according to this timeline, according to the information here. And we also said that things that happened at the bottom were more likely to have happened later. And you can see it even by the year, 1998 is definitely after 1701. And so one of the last things that happened according to this chart was the Petronas Twin Towers were completed. And in Detroit, Henry Ford started the Ford Motor Company in Detroit, attracting many people to the city. So make sure that you annotate the graph, you underline the clues that you're looking for, you're answering the questions, and then we're going to read the dates and the events on the timeline. What happened in 1998 in Kuala Lumpur? So you have to look for the year 1998. In this case, we know it's not this one because this one says 1857, not 1895, and definitely not 1957. So it has to only be this one because it matches up. And you already know what happened in 1998. And then the other question is, what year did Detroit become Michigan's capital? So looking at these little boxes, I'm going to let you figure out what happened or what year Detroit became Michigan's capital. And you can circle that too. And now we're going to get started on charting history on timelines. If you want to tell people what you did today, you would most likely list events in a certain order. You would tell what you did first or earliest in the day. Then you would describe later activities. You would end by explaining what you did most recently. In history, we do the same thing with timelines. A timeline lists historical events in the order in which they occurred. So let's pause for a second. We already know that this timeline showed what happened earliest at the top and what happened latest at the bottom. So it's trying to say that this timeline definitely shows parts of what happened in this city during the year that it happened in. So you can see it with the labels and the numbers, and that explains why they have the numbers listed like this. Events are listed from first, or those in the most distant past, to last, or those in the most recent past. The past refers to events that happened before now. A timeline most often lists information from left to right or top to bottom. Study this example. So yes, there are multiple forms of timelines. If you were making a timeline like this in your project, then you could definitely start with the last or the earliest thing that you wanted to write about on the top and the latest thing that you wanted to talk about on the bottom. So these are events. These are important things that happened for Detroit and important things that happened for Kuala Lumpur. And now in this photo on the bottom, we have the steps of the Batu Caves in Kuala Lumpur. You can see how many stairs there are all the way to the top to lead to the caves. Finding evidence, you're going to reread and check what does the timeline tell you about the two communities. Then you're going to compare what is something that the two communities have in common. So in order to find something that they have in common, you need to check each and every one of these and see if there's anything in here that talks about something that they might both have. Because Detroit is in the US and Kuala Lumpur is in Southeast Asia. And so do you think that anything from the Americas and from Southeast Asia could have something in common? Make sure that you check each and every one of these so that way you can see if they share anything. Then the last thing you're going to do is you're going to look at the photographs of Kuala Lumpur and Detroit on the other page, and where on the timeline for these cities do you think you would place these photographs and why? So even in your project, you guys are going to be using photos on your timeline. So if, for example, you wanted to give this as an example of a timeline that you made. For this first one, Detroit becomes the first Michigan state capital, Lansing later made capital, right? If you wanted to show a picture of what Detroit looks like now, you could do that. Or if you could find an old historical photo of what Detroit looked like in 1837, that would probably work better. If you wanted to talk about Kuala Lumpur, for example, and you wanted to say Chinese tin miners founded a settlement in Kuala Lumpur, then you would see if there's any images or drawings or information that could show, that could prove that you researched it and found images about it. And you would have to explain, of course, why you put it there and what the connection is. So if you chose this one and you wanted to put an image of Chicago early on after it was created, then you have to put it next to the point, the event that happened. So make sure that when you do your project, you show your photos next to the events, so that way it makes sense. Because otherwise it'll look like you have photos, but the events are not connected to it. Now we're on page 170. If you're following along in your social studies practice book. And on this page, you can already see that we're going to be talking about summarizing. We've talked about summarizing before, that you have to find out what is the text trying to tell you, what are the important pieces of information that it's trying to tell you. And we're going to be doing the exact same thing here. So don't worry about if you feel like you've never done it before. We've done it a bunch of times in class, and we're going to be doing the same thing here. So let's find out what they want from us. So it says explore summarizing. You can summarize a historical text such as a timeline. To do so, you must tell most important details in your own words. So make sure you remember that part, in your own words. That means that you are going to be explaining it, not word for word, not copying it from one side of the page to the other side of the page. No, you have to figure out what's another way that you can say this. If you were trying to tell it to somebody else and you weren't trying to look at the book, how would you say that information? That's what it means to say it in your own words. Then the first thing you're going to do is read the text on the timeline all the way through. This will help you understand the events on the timeline. You've already seen the timeline. You already know what it looks like. So make sure that while you're doing this part, you're flipping back and forth so that way you can see what you're talking about, which event you're talking about. Then you're going to reread the timeline and look for how dates connect. See what happens from one date to the next. There's probably going to be a connection. Otherwise, they wouldn't be showing them so close together. And they are usually trying to show that there is a main connecting thing between all of these points. Kind of like how we had the main ideas for English. But in this case, for social studies, we're having a main idea, but talking about time. Then the third thing you're going to do is retell the information in your own words. Include the main ideas and the most important details. So for this one, it says list key events for Detroit or Kuala Lumpur. Then summarize what you know about the city you chose. First thing you have to do, we already see it. You have to choose whether you want to talk about Detroit or Kuala Lumpur. So that's your choice. You can choose whichever city you want from those two, and then make sure that you use your timeline as your resource and your reference. So for the first main idea or the first detail that we're going to look at, make sure that you look at your previous page, and you can go ahead and flip over to it and choose a main idea that you want to focus on that is going to help you create a summary. But you need to make sure that you find that you find details that all share a main point. So we'll do it together as an example. So for me, I chose to write about Kuala Lumpur because I thought that that was a cool city to write about. And so something that I noticed from the details, one of the first details that I noticed was that it says how Kuala Lumpur was created by miners who were looking for tin. And I believe the year was 1857. Then another detail that I noticed was that the British took over the city of Kuala Lumpur and created the Malay states. But then almost 100 years later, I believe, in 1957, Malaysia got its independence from Britain. And so if I were going to write that summary, the first detail that I would put would be that Malaysia was created by Chinese miners looking for tin in 1857. My second detail would be that Britain turned Kuala Lumpur into a colony and turned Malaysia into a colony and created the Malay states. And then I would put the year that happened. And the last detail that I would put is that in 1957, Malaysia gained its independence from the United Kingdom or the British Empire. And then here on the summary portion, I would take these details from these sentences that I had just made because they don't match exactly to the timeline. And we can even compare it. The years will match because I need the years to be 100% right. So Chinese tin miners in 1857, 1895, the federal Malay states is created under British rule, and that Kuala Lumpur becomes the capital. And then 1957, they gained their independence, so about 100 years later. But when I'm saying it in my own words, that's not how I said it just now. But when I write it out, I'm going to take these sentences. So my first detail, my second detail, and my third detail, I would say first, Malaysia or Kuala Lumpur was founded by Chinese miners looking for tin in 1857. Next, or then, the British Empire took control over Kuala Lumpur and created the Malay states in whatever year that was. And then I would put a period. And of course, the last sentence I would put is then in 1957, Malaysia gained its independence from the United Kingdom and created Malaysia as a whole, and that Kuala Lumpur became its national capital. And that's how I would do it. If you were going to choose if you were going to choose Detroit, then you would just be looking back and doing the exact same thing, figuring out which detail you think is important. So if you wanted to talk about how Detroit was created in 1701, then Britain took control of Detroit. And then lastly, if you wanted to choose that Detroit became the first Michigan state capital and later became Lansing capital, then you could say that the first part would be this detail, the second part would be this detail, and the last part could be this detail. It all depends on what you're saying is your main point, what happened first, second, and third. And then make sure that you rewrite it down here on the summary using your neatest handwriting. Use complete sentences, please, so that way you are using your punctuation and your capital letters, and make sure that you are doing third grade work. Now we're going to get started on the investigate page. And we're going to be reading from your textbooks, pages 180 to 187. And then we're going to be looking for text evidence that tells us about how communities of Kuala Lumpur and Detroit developed and changed over time. The charts will help us organize your information for each community. So you can already see there are two separate charts here. Yes, there's a line connecting them, but there's also a line separating them. And so you can choose if you want to write about Kuala Lumpur on this side, or if you want to write it on this side and have Detroit on the other side, or if you want to have Detroit on this side. But one side is going to be about Kuala Lumpur, and the other side will be about Detroit, Michigan. And then we're going to be looking for text evidence. So that means inside the text, we are going to be looking for resources. We are going to be looking for information that tells us about the communities of Kuala Lumpur and Detroit and how they developed and changed over time. So that's what we're going to be looking out for. So if you see anything while we're reading through the text, feel free to pause the video, write down the detail, and then put it together at the end once you have at least 4 details. All right, let's get started. And I believe in your textbook, we are on page 180. What can comparing different communities tell us about how communities change over time? Still in lesson 5. Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and Detroit, Michigan. This image right here is Kuala Lumpur, and it's the capital of Malaysia, and it says it's in Southeast Asia. These are actually the Petronas Towers right here. You can see it even right there at the little bridge. If you've ever gotten a coin from Malaysia, this is on their coin, their national coin. Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and Detroit, Michigan. Communities around the world change over time. Often they grow larger. Sometimes they get smaller. People, businesses, and technologies change. Let's look at the history of 2 communities in different countries. Understanding their history can help us understand how our communities grow and change. So right here on the right, we had Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, Southeast Asia, we talked about it. And here's a picture of Detroit, Michigan, right here in the United States. I believe they're 5 hours away by flight. But I need to check that. Let's go to the next page. Why people move to Detroit. The city of Detroit lies near the Great Lakes in the United States. It sits on the Detroit River, a waterway between Lake Erie and the smaller Lake St. Clair. The name Detroit comes from the French word for strait. A strait is a narrow waterway connecting 2 larger bodies of water. So we have the definition of the word strait highlighted right there and the definition right after that. People have lived in the area for thousands of years. Fertile lands, forests, and fresh waterways provided important natural resources. Pause for a second. Who do you remember we talked about living in the United States before it was even called the United States? What did we call America, or what did we call the people who lived in America before Europeans came? We talked about it in the previous chapters, and I want you to pause for a second. You can even annotate, actually, this is your textbook, so maybe not annotate this, but think about what group of people lived in the United States before European settlers arrived, and before we we have the cities that we have now, because we talked about it in the other social studies lessons, so make sure that you check. The first inhabitants were Native Americans, known as the Wyandot. They used the river and lakes to fish, trade, and travel. And here's a picture of Detroit around 1920. In the early 1700s, French settlers built Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit along the river. They wanted to trade furs and other goods with the Wyandot. Later, the British took control of the site and called it Fort Detroit. The Detroit River and the Great Lakes became part of a large system of trade. Throughout the 1700s, more French than British came. Many stayed to build homes and farms. The fort grew into a town. This is all about Detroit. So if you remember on the previous workbook page, we talked about one side you're going to label as Detroit, the other side you're going to label as Kuala Lumpur. So if you found any interesting details, make sure that you wrote them here. Some interesting details that I found would be that it is between the Great Lakes, and it's on the Detroit River, and that the name comes from the French word for straight. So this is maybe a detail that I would put. Detroit comes from the French word for straight. And then I would put that it had Native Americans living there for thousands of years before, and it was used for its rivers, lakes to fish, travel, and trade. And then I would put that in the early 1700s, French settlers built Fort Pontchartrain du Detroit along the river. The reason why I would want to put this would be because I would want to show that the French word for Detroit comes from the French settlers who came later. So if I were to start, I would maybe put this detail first and then the detail after that about where the word Detroit comes from second. And maybe before that, I would put that Native Americans have lived there and that the Wyandot have lived there for thousands of years before the French came. So first about the Wyandot, second about the French settlers, third about why Detroit has its name. And then the last thing that I would put would probably be how the British took control of the site and later named it Fort Detroit. So that would probably be the last bit of information that I would put there. And so this is slowly changing from the first part where the Native Americans were living there, second to when the French took over and then they named it a different name, and then the British came. So you can already see that slowly starting to change. And then later on the bottom part, I would just put a summary of it, which means I would take all of these tiny details and put them as individual sentences. So first, Native Americans were living in what we now call Detroit. The Native Americans were called the Wyandot. Then the French settlers came and created the fort there, and the British took it over from them and named it Fort Detroit. So these are 3 or 4 details that would help create my summary. Now let's read about Kuala Lumpur. Why people move to Kuala Lumpur. Kuala Lumpur is the capital city of Malaysia, a country in Southeast Asia. Kuala Lumpur lies on a peninsula, a piece of land surrounded by water on 3 sides. If you have seen the map of the United States, we actually have a peninsula too. It's the state of Florida. And the way that you can tell is that Florida has a peninsula because it has water from the Atlantic Ocean on the east side. And then it also has water from the Gulf of Mexico below. And I would say that the tip of it is right between where the Caribbean and so on are. But most of Florida is surrounded by water. Ancestors of the Malay ethnic group came to the region about 3,000 years ago. They blended cultures in the area. In time, towns grew and formed governments. In the 1400s, the Kingdom of Malacca formed. So they already had a kingdom in the 1400s, which they called Malacca. Starting in the 1500s, the Portuguese, Dutch, and British came to the region. They wanted to trade and start colonies. They built ports that grew rich from the spice trade. In 1857, the Chinese started a tin mining settlement, which is now Kuala Lumpur. So first, it's talking about, the main idea of this paragraph was talking about where is Kuala Lumpur and what is a peninsula. Then it talks about the people of Kuala Lumpur and who they were and how did they get there. And then lastly, they talked about the Portuguese, Dutch, and British settlers that came into that region and how they wanted to start colonies. And then, of course, lastly, they talked about the Chinese that started a tin mining settlement in the area that we now call Kuala Lumpur. But it's also talking about Malaysia as a whole, because it even says capital city of Malaysia. If we compare that to the other side, it talks about the name and the body or where it's located for Detroit. It talks about the people of Detroit before the settlers came, and then it talks lastly about the settlers who came afterwards. So now if I'm going to take the same information and put it back in this chart, then I could probably do the same thing where I start talking about first where it's located. Then I could talk about who was there. So because the Kingdom of Malacca was there in the 1400s, and the ethnic group, the Malay ethnic group, were there for around 3,000 years before. I could even then talk about how in the 1500s, the settlers came to build colonies in the region as my third detail. And the last detail I could put would be in 1857, the Chinese started a tin mining settlement in what is now called Kuala Lumpur. So that would be my last detail. And so when I would put it in summary form, I would put it as 4 separate sentences talking about first, the location. Kuala Lumpur is located in Southeast Asia, and then a period. Then I would say it was part of the Kingdom of Malacca by the Malay people who lived there for over 3,000 years. And then I would have another period at the end of that sentence. Then I would put that the Dutch, Portuguese, and British settlers came to start colonies and do trade as my third sentence. And the last sentence I would put would be about how Kuala Lumpur was established by, was created by early Chinese settlers looking for tin, or early Chinese miners looking for tin. Let's go to the next page. That's all from the first 2 pages. If you wanted to do these 2 pages instead, you could totally do these 2 pages as well. You don't have to choose all the information from 1 page. I'm giving an example so that way you understand how to create your own paragraphs using your own words. So now that we finished the first page talking about Detroit, how it was created, the history of it, now let's talk about the businesses in Detroit. Detroit became an official city in 1815. Soon after, Detroit began to grow. Steamboats and railroads made it easier for people and goods to travel to and from the city. People started businesses and factories. Mills turned grain into flour to ship back east. In 1896, Henry Ford built his first automobile in a workshop in Detroit. The city soon became the center of the nation's auto industry. So do you remember when I was asking earlier about who was the person that helped create automobiles and make them affordable for regular people? We have the answer right here, Henry Ford. The city soon became the center of the nation's auto industry. Many people moved to Detroit to work in its auto factories. Others worked in shipping on the docks and the rail yards. Some started restaurants, laundries, and stores. Over time, people from many different cultures and backgrounds came to move to Detroit. The city became more diverse. Then in the 1950s, many people started moving to new communities outside Detroit called suburbs. So let's look at these images. In the recent years, people have sought to renew downtown Detroit with projects like this garden. You can already see they've got rows of different plants growing and different shapes of the land. And this is all within the city. So it's not even on a farm. As you can see, there's a huge building back there. And you can even see for now, the then and now, abandoned houses in the city of Detroit. During the late 1900s, the auto industry started to struggle. Many people and businesses left Detroit. Buildings and homes were abandoned. In the 2000s, efforts were made to rebuild some parts of the city. Leaders wanted to bring people and businesses back. Let's continue to businesses in Kuala Lumpur. In the 1800s, the British built the Kuala Lumpur Railway. Europeans started coffee, tea, and rubber plantations or large farms. They supplied trade and business in the city. As in Detroit, many people moved to the city to work. In 1963, several British colonies formed the Independent Federation of Malaysia. In the late 1900s, Kuala Lumpur became the center of banking and trade. Malaysia's national oil company, Petronas, moved its headquarters to the city. The government built libraries, museums, and public transportation. A light rail train made it easier to get around in the growing city. A light rail train is very similar to a bullet train. If you've ever seen the kind that's in Japan, it moves very fast and can travel at high speeds. In 2016, the city had an estimated 1.76 million people. Detroit and Kuala Lumpur are communities with exciting histories. You might like to learn about the history of your community and how it has helped change and how it has changed over time. Here are some resources to help you. So in your project that you're going to be turning in at the end of next week, so next week, Monday, you are going to need to research the community that you're writing about. That means that you can use these resources as well. So first you can check the local library. The librarian can help you find books and other resources about your town's history. Pay a visit to a local history museum. Stop at the local newspaper office. It might have news stories and photos from your town's past. Visit your town's website. So this is if you choose to write about your town. If you choose to write about another town, you can do that as well. So you're just going to be looking maybe at their online library, looking if there's an online history museum, if they have an online newspaper, or if they have, of course, a website. And then, yes, stop and check to answer this question. How did industry help Detroit and Kuala Lumpur grow? We already know that business in Detroit is both of these pages about business. In Detroit, it said that it was talking about how Detroit had a lot of business in the beginning, but then later it started losing business, which is why they started having the abandoned houses. And even in the middle, right here, it talks about what they started building: restaurants, rail yards, shipping companies, auto factories, and that's all within Detroit. For Malaysia or Kuala Lumpur, you can see that Europeans started coffee, tea, and rubber plantations. This isn't to say that there weren't already trades happening over there, but these were bigger ones that they started using or they started creating on the land in Malaysia. Then it says here, as in Detroit, many people moved to the city to work. In 1963, several British colonies formed the Independent Federation of Malaysia. So when there was a lot of business, then people started to move, and then that created new communities. Let's go to the next page. So now we're going to be talking about citizenship and saving community landmarks. Historic landmarks in Detroit, Kuala Lumpur, and other communities remind people of the past. Landmarks are well-known places that people like to visit. They also highlight the roles of different cultures. Landmarks can be buildings or places that played a special role in historical events. They can also be museums and statues to honor the people in the past or the time before now. So it doesn't have to be super ancient. It doesn't have to be something that was thousands of years ago. It can be even this one, 1959, which is not more than maybe 70 years ago, definitely not 100. And it says Berry Gordy Jr. founded the Motown Record Corporation in Detroit. In 1985, Gordy's sister founded the Motown Museum when the company moved its headquarters to California. So now they're located in California, but this was the original one. And here on the bottom, we have, though no longer the main railway hub, the Kuala Lumpur railway station is a symbol of the city's mixed path. You can see, even in the other lesson, we talked about how when a community has multiple groups living in there, then the buildings are going to show it because they're going to have different designs than buildings made by just one group. So you can see it here that even though we know the Portuguese, the British, and the Dutch came, their buildings might not be designed exactly the same as these ones are. And this is the the Kuala Lumpur railway station. Many groups work to save landmarks in Detroit and Kuala Lumpur. The Detroit Historical Society helps identify and save landmarks. So too does the Michigan State Historic Preservation Office. Dozens of cultural, arts programs support local, historic, and other types of landmarks. In Malaysia, several agencies under the Ministry of Tourism and Cultures takes care of the nation's cultural and historic sites. The National Museum in Kuala Lumpur saves much of the nation's history. So this is all talking about Kuala Lumpur's historic site. Here we have Medan Pasar, or the Market Square, once served as the center of the economic activity in Kuala Lumpur. Today, many modern cafes, shops, and boutiques and other businesses line the square. So this was used a lot in the past. And here we have Joe Louis, was a famous African-American boxer. He grew up in Detroit and went on to win many championships. In 1986, the city built the statue to celebrate his life. So these were, again, famous people, famous locations that helped impact the communities that live there. So here, if you wanted to check yourself, stop and check. Choose one old building in your community. Why do you think the building should be saved as an important historic landmark? Give at least 3 reasons. So if you chose a library, why do you think a library is important to keep? It doesn't have to really be in danger of getting rid of, but why do you think a building like a library or a building like a bridge, if we wanted to give an example of the Coronado Bridge, why do you think the Coronado Bridge is important if they were going to build another one? Do you think that it has a lot of history to it? Do you think that it's very helpful? Do you think that it had a reason to be built? So that's just one example that you can use to stop and check yourself. And that is the end of lesson 5. So let's go back to answer our questions. Think about it. So we are going to be answering, gather evidence. Based on your research about Kuala Lumpur and Detroit, what information do you want to find out about your community? What resources could you use to learn about your community and its history? So if you were to use the information that we just read about, we talked about businesses in Kuala Lumpur and Detroit. We talked about the history of Kuala Lumpur and Detroit. So if you were going to be looking about history of a specific community, then you could mention that. You could mention that based on the information that you read about Kuala Lumpur and the information that you read about Detroit, I know that I need to look for information about the businesses in the city of, if you were talking about San Diego, you could write in the city of San Diego. What I read was about the history of the people and the cultures that came to Kuala Lumpur and to Detroit. So if I was to look for information about my own community, I would look for the information about the people and the history of San Diego. So those are some types of sentences that I would add for this part. And I would say make sure that you add at least 3 sentences talking about what types of resources you could use. We talked about libraries, we talked about websites, and we talked about historical societies, newspapers. The internet is a resource, but make sure that you use, you go on there with parent supervision and you don't just go on there by yourself, because the internet has a lot of information on there. It takes a while to process it. Next, you're going to write about it. So you're going to explain. Make a list of topics about your community that you want to research. How could you encourage someone to move to your community? So first, you're going to make a list. If I was to write about San Diego, what would be my list of things that I would want to research about here? So maybe I would talk about the people who used to live here, the people who live here now, how San Diego became part of the United States, if San Diego is a safe place, and maybe about the different cultures that are here now. So those are at least 5 that I can list. If I was to write or encourage someone to move to San Diego, then I would write sentences about different things that I think would be important for someone moving here. That could include if they want to live in a place that has a lot of different cultures, then they could definitely add that to the details. I could definitely add that. I could say San Diego is filled with many different cultures. It has lots of events. We have lots of social events, historical events, and car shows, different things that I think whoever I'm talking to would be interested in, because I have to know if I'm writing something, how am I talking to them? What's my audience? Who am I writing to? And I could say that San Diego is very safe. Based on where I live, I could say that it's very active, and that there's always good places to visit, like parks. And those are all things I can use to encourage someone to move to my community. For the connect to the essential question, make sure that you are pulling it together, and you're going to think about ways that your community has changed over the years. How have these changes affected the lives of people living in the community today? So if I were to continue talking about San Diego, just because I don't know what city you wrote about, but if I were to write about San Diego, I could write about how originally San Diego was part of Spain back when Mexico had California. And then later when the United States took it, it became part of the United States. I can mention that there have been people living here for thousands of years. There are Native Americans living here. Then later on, Spanish colonies were created, and now we have many streets that are still in Spanish or come from Spanish words because of the colonies that were created. And then now that's my old information, and my new information is how it has Spanish names. I could say that San Diego still has a large Hispanic or Latin community because we are very close to the border, and because San Diego has always been very mixed, and that we have lots of people who were already here before the United States took it from Spain. And now there are many generations of Spanish people living here, and there are many different cultures living here who have moved from different parts of the US or different parts of the world. And I can connect all of those things with how people living here today are all interconnected. Because if you look at even our own community, we know that it's not just one group it's a mix of people. It has people from every different culture from almost every part of the world. And so that definitely affects how the community that we live in today looks like. So once you're done with that, make sure that you scan and upload it to Google Classroom. Please use your neatest handwriting, and we will continue to Chapter 4, Lesson 6 next time.